Welcome to God's Rescue and Restoration Plan. This is session 6, Abraham and Isaac. Whoops, there I am. Okay. We went through a lot of material in the last session, and so we need to kind of refresh ourselves on what we're seeing or what we talked about. And it was really about Abraham, right? And all the things that God did. And it was amazing. He had promised him countless offspring, a crowd of nations, a blessing to all nations, that he would be a blessing in his progeny and his bloodline would be a blessing to all nations. The bloodline of Messiah is going to come there. He promised land, the promised land, and he would have a son and an heir. We also saw that circumcision was introduced as the memorial and with strict observance, that promise and reminder of it. The promised land we saw and talked about how the complete fulfillment is still future. Certainly when Joshua went in with Israel, he conquered a lot of it. And David did as well later on, but never completely. The complete fulfillment of that promise will be when the Lord returns. And we saw how Abraham had one son from Sarah, which was foreshadowing God's one son from Mary, and talked about how uh, expecting that Mary would be very familiar with that record, that it must have been of great comfort and help and inspiration to her when Gabriel came to announce a birth to her, even though it wasn't possible for her either. So great learning and great topics to remember and think about as we see and start tracing the unfolding of God's rescue and restoration plan. And then we also realize that the devil's going to focus on Abraham's family now. He doesn't have to worry about the rest of the population. He just needs to trace that lineage, and that is what he does because he is desperately trying to prevent the Messiah from being born. So let's go to today's topic. Starting with the map, we had a big map last week, last session, but this time we're kind of zoomed into it. And this is, you can see the Dead Sea here, and over this little blue area, that's just the edge of the Mediterranean Sea to kind of get your bearings of what we're looking at. And there in the yellow circle is Mamre. That's where Yahweh and the two angels came and had the conversation with Abraham and Sarah about the child, where Yahweh told them that Sarah was going to have a child at the set time next year, and he'd come back and see it and all that. And that's where that conversation happened. This is Sodom and Gomorrah, and the two angels that were with Yahweh on that visit were on their way to Sodom and Gomorrah to destroy it. And so stopping here gave Abraham an opportunity to negotiate with God. And we didn't read that part, but he worked to save his nephew and his nephew's family, Lot, that was in Sodom and Gomorrah. And indeed, they had the opportunity to escape that, and some did, some didn't. But at any rate, Sodom and Gomorrah is there at the bottom in that yellow circle. I don't know that Abraham ever went there in person. It doesn't say that he did, but he knew that his nephew was down there. So after Sodom and Gomorrah happened, for whatever reason, Abraham shifted farther west. I don't know if it's because the destruction damaged grazing land or whatever reason it was. He migrated to the west. And we see Gerar there. That's where Abimelech was, King Abimelech. We read that record where he took Sarah as his wife, not knowing that she was Abraham's wife, and all the commotion that caused and how God salvaged his plan. He kept it going because of how he intervened into that situation and kind of bailed out Abraham. But anyway, that's where that is. That's where Isaac was born. That's where Isaac was weaned and became the true heir of Abraham. From there, they went to Beersheba, and that's some years later, and that is where our record starts. He's in Beersheba, and we're going to start with Genesis chapter 22, verse 1. And after these things, all these things that have happened, and some we've read, some we didn't read, but leading up to this chapter, after all these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham? And he said, Here I am. And I just love that about Abraham. When you read it, it just sounds like he's right there, Johnny on the spot, answers right away. He's got his full attention. He's listening and he's aware and he's ready for God to talk to him. And that's a great lesson for us. I want to look, though, at this word tested. Tested is translated from the word nasa, that's the Hebrew word, and it can be translated to test or it can be translated to tempt. And so to decide which way is right, which way is correct, you really have to look at the context and kind of understand the difference between test and tempt. And it really boils down to motivation or the desired outcome of the action. Is the tempter, is the person trying to cause that person to fail? And if that's true, then the word would be tempting, to tempt. But if the purpose of the person executing this or starting this is to help the individual, to strengthen them in some way, then the word would be to test. And we know from James chapter 1, verse 13, no one should say when he's tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. God never tempts anyone. So right there from that verse, we know this cannot be, should not be translated tempted, because God would not tempt Abraham, but he could test him. I know that in my King James Bible that I used for many years, it had tempted there. I think the New King James has corrected that to just test. And the versions that come out today, all the ones I've seen anyway, say tested and not tempted. Rightfully so. So God tested Abraham. So this word tested, it could be, it's like testing our limits. It's pushing us to our limits in a category of life. So for example, maybe I'm a patient person. I have lots of patience normally. But now I'm in a situation and I'm really getting agitated. I'm really getting involved. My patience is being tested. I'm getting to the edge of my capability of patience. So it's being tested and it's getting to the edge. How far can I go? And that's kind of the test in that sense. So that's what God's going to be doing with Abraham here. And it's pretty interesting to see how this plays out. Verse 2, it says, Then he said, Yahweh said this to Abraham, Now take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go into the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will tell you of. So I want to unpack this verse because there's quite a bit in this. First, we're going to look at this phrase, Now take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac. Have it in red there. This phrase is really an expression of a father-son relationship. And it's the relationship that Abraham has with Isaac. But as we will see, this record that we're reading is also a parallel as informative to the relationship and to what God and Jesus are going to go through a long time later. It's a parallel, and you can see this unfolding as we start with this. So he says, Now take your son, Abraham, your son. Remember the son that you wanted, you desired, you finally have him. 100 years you had to wait for your son, that son, your son. God had to wait a long, long time for his only begotten son, but it's your son. And it's your only son. It's the only son that you have. It's him or nothing. He's the one that the promise goes forward with, your only son. And for God, the only begotten son he has, he is the Messiah, the only one whom you love. You have affection for him. You have appreciation. You deeply love your son, your only son. You love him. And God loves Jesus too like that. Abraham loves Isaac like that. And it is Isaac by name. It's personal. It's intimate. It's by name. all of these things, Isaac, Jesus, your son, your only son, whom you love, all of these things apply to the relationship of Abraham with Isaac and God with Jesus. And it makes it really difficult to do what they are asked to do, or what Isaac or Abraham is asked to do. And it had to be hard for God to do what he did as well. Go into the land of Moriah. It doesn't say go to Mount Moriah. Moriah, let's look at the map. That's where it is. It's right up there. This is the area that has Jerusalem in it, and Mount Moriah is part of that. There's a number of mountains in the land of Moriah, and one of them is Mount Moriah, and that is the mount that the temple's on. So over the years, there's been many teachers, scholars, and so on that teach that this activity of Abraham with Isaac happened on Mount Moriah, where the temple is. That doesn't make sense if this is a parallel record with Jesus, because Jesus clearly did not get crucified in the temple. So it had to be somewhere else. And since there's many mountains there, there's a number of us, certainly at least, that believe very strongly that the Bible record really takes us to the likely place for Jesus being crucified is on the Mount of Olives, and that's just across the valley from Mount Moriah. It's right next door. And so anyway, we don't know that for sure, but it seems very likely. And the point there is God isn't telling them which mountain to go to. He's just telling them to go to the land of Moriah. And when you get there, offer Isaac as a burnt offering. Now, a burnt offering is different and unique in terms of the offerings of animals. And we see this when Moses comes through and the law comes out about all the sacrifices, and we learn a lot about sacrifices. But there are a lot of sacrifices going on by now anyway. And sacrifices were the animal is sacrificed, but then in turn it is prepared as food for people, for the Levites down the road with Moses and on. Um, so it helps feed people, but not a burnt offering. A burnt offering means that animal is killed, is slaughtered, but burnt completely. It's all in. It's all in on that sacrifice. Everything it's got is consumed by that sacrifice. And that's what Isaac was to be, the burnt offering. And one of the mountains that I will tell you of. When you get there, I'll point out which one to go to, but he hasn't told them which one yet. Okay, so verse 3. So Abraham rises up early in the morning, and he saddles his donkey and took two of his young men, so they're servants, with him to help, and Isaac his son, of course. And he split the wood for the burnt offering, which I thought was interesting. He took the wood with him, and I would think it would take a lot of wood to do this, to do a burnt offering like that. But he got it there. He split it, burnt offering, and he rose up and he went to the place that God had told him of. So he started out. And the journey goes along this long red arrow. So he starts here in Beersheba, and then he goes along this road and he heads up to this area, Mount Moriah. And on the third day, he's traveled for 3 days now, and he's getting close, and there he is, and he lifts up his eyes and saw the place in the distance. So God showed him, there it is, that's the spot I want you to go to, and Abraham saw that. Then Abraham said to his young men, okay, stay here with the donkey while the boy and I go over there and bow down and worship and then come back to you. And Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. So if the donkey was carrying it, then he took it off the donkey and put it on Isaac to carry it, which I would think would be a big load. Again, it would take a lot of wood, I would think. And but that's what it says. He put it on his son. And here again, we think about the parallel record. If you recall, when Jesus, after he had been gone through all of the trials, and now he's with the Romans, and they're torturing him and they're mocking him and all that, and then the day comes the new day comes when he's going to be crucified and he's let out. And what is he supposed to carry? And what does he carry? It's the cross, the crossbeam that he's going to be crucified on. It's wood. And here Isaac's carrying wood, and it's the wood of the burnt offering that he's going to be part of. Much later, Jesus has wood on him carrying as far as he could. Again, the wood that he's going to be offered on. And so we see that parallel really tying together. And then Abraham took in his own hand the fire and the knife, and the two of them walked on together. Makes me wonder, I imagine God was right there with Jesus too, together. Verse 7, and Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, son. And he said, well, here's the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? I'm not seeing an animal here. So what's happening with that? And Abraham said, God will himself see to providing the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they both went together. So it's an interesting thing. They go on. God's going to provide, and I think about that with Jesus. You know, part of the reason for the Old Testament being written was for Jesus, that as he grew up, he could become educated about God, of course, and all the things that led up to it, but also about himself and what his mission was and what his role was, what was going to happen, all that kind of stuff. He had a lot of learning about his life written in this Bible, in what we call the Bible, Old Testament. And so, and it wouldn't have punctuation and capitalized letters. They would be different, and it would be all running together and so on. And so you could read this. I'm thinking that he could read. I'm just imagining him reading this, saying, and Abraham said, he's answering, and God will himself see to providing the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. Just God like saying that to Jesus, my son. That's you. You're the lamb. I don't know if that happened, but I can see how that could happen. And you know, if I can see it, I'm sure he could have. So but they both went together. And then in verse 9, and they came to that place, the place that God had told them of, and Abraham built the altar there, arranged the wood, and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar, on the wood. Now, it doesn't say that there was an argument about that. It doesn't say there were that Isaac struggled and tried to get away from it or had any physical altar. It doesn't say anything like that. And you know, if there had been, I think Isaac would have won anything physical because he's only 30 years old and Abraham's 130 years old. I think Isaac would have won that battle. But that's not what it says. And so you can only think that, well, Abraham said, this is God. God told me this is what I'm to do. And Isaac saying, I don't like this, but I'm trusting you and I'll go with it. I'll do what God wants done, even though I don't like it. And isn't that what Jesus was too? He's in the garden and he's praying with his heart. If there's any other way to do this, let this cup pass from me, but your will be done. And I'm going to do what you want me to do. And Isaac did that too. In verse 10, Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. So just think about that. He's got Isaac stretched out in the wood. He's bound. And now he's reaching for his knife and he gets it and he's getting poisoned. He says, how can I make this as painless as possible for Isaac? And he's just getting ready to go. And the angel called out to him of Yahweh, called to him from heaven, said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am, poised. And he said, do not reach out your hand toward the boy. Do not do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And then Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked and saw that behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. Abraham went, took the ram, offered him up for a burnt offering in place of his son. Now, we have the parallel of this record with what God and Jesus did much later. And Abraham's kind of playing the role of God in this story. Isaac's playing the role of Jesus, the promised seed, the Messiah in this role. But I think what happens right at that moment when the angel declares stop, knowing there's a replacement behind, I think at that moment the role that Isaac is playing switches from the Messiah to mankind. Mankind deserves to die. Mankind's gonna die. Mankind, now we know, would go into the second death, but he's rescued. Mankind is rescued. There he is, ready to burn, but he's rescued because there's a replacement, and it's a sheep, it's a ram, and the replacement appears. So mankind is saved by the substitution sacrifice of that ram. And I think that's how that story plays out, and the comparison plays out because Isaac goes forward, is spared. So Abraham called the name of that place, Yahweh will provide. It seems very fitting. Yahweh, and just think if that did indeed happen on the Mount of Olives, just think about that. Yahweh did provide that. So many years later, the substitution sacrifice, which is coming. And it is said to this day, on Yahweh's mountain, it will be provided. That's right. And the angel of Yahweh called to Abraham a second time out of heaven. And he said, I have sworn by myself, says Yahweh, because you have done this thing, unconditional, and have not withheld your son, your only son, that I will bless, yes, bless you. There's that figure, the double bless. Bless you. And I will make your seed many, yes, many, like the stars of the heavens and like the sand that's on the seashore, and your seed will possess the gate of his enemies. So you will win battles and you will have the upper hand. Through your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. We have a lot to be grateful for Abraham passing the test, to strengthening and to be resolved to obey God no matter what. And it worked out. And so Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose up, they went to Beersheba, and Abraham lived in Beersheba. The other thing I think about, though, with this record is how hard that had to be for Abraham. You know, it's a father, and all the emotions would be there, and he loved his son. It was his only son, and he's thinking, you know, God promised me the son. He's my heir, my only, and that's how the promise goes forward. Yet he's telling me to kill him, to sacrifice him. And how do you reconcile those two things? How do you do that? Well, he did, though. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 19, talking about this specific thing, it says, he, Abraham, reasoned that God was able to raise him up, even from among the dead, from which, as a parable, he did receive him back. So Abraham's thinking, yeah, I'm supposed to sacrifice him, but God can raise him from the dead and he'll be fine. That was the conclusion Abraham had. And we can actually see that back in verse 5, Genesis 22, verse 5. It says, then Abraham, this is when he's with the servants and they're getting organized to go for Isaac and Abraham to leave and to go up to the spot. It says, then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey while the boy and I go over there and bow down and worship, then come back to you. So he's saying, the boy and I go over there, then come back to you. He's even there. He's saying that we're both coming back, and so I think he must have had that in his mind already at this moment. That's the way I'm reading that verse. And I go over there, bow down, then come back to you, both of us. I think grammatically that's what it says. So it is a wonderful record, and it makes us think and appreciate Adam and what he did, as well as Isaac, really, to play his role. But then God and how he's played this all out and has orchestrated this event and told ahead of time what was going to happen. It's just a wonderful thing. And I want to go back through what we've learned now and talked about in these sessions, but think about it from the point of view of God's rescue and restoration plan. How is it developing? From the very beginning, it's very blurry. It's very fuzzy. We really don't know much at all about it. We know that right after Adam fell, the promise of the woman, the seed of the woman, the Messiah, is made, and that a man's going to come and contend with the serpent. So we know that's coming, but we don't know much more. And then with Noah promising soul life, a solid and stable environment to live in. Not going to flood it again, kill everything. No, it's going to be solid. The seasons are going to continue. The hot and the cold is going to continue. It's a stable environment with which to live. And then with Abraham promising all those things, the offspring, the crowd of nations, the bloodline of Messiah coming that way, the promised land. He's setting up the infrastructure, if you will, to have a special, peculiar nation of people, a certain group of people, and that becomes a nation that will be his for a particular purpose. And he's setting that in motion in this plan. And you can see it starting to happen. The crowd of nations, a blessing to all nations because of the Messiah, the promised land for my people, a son and an heir through which it passes. That circumcision, a reminder of the believing God, the promised land with fulfillment still future. Abraham having the one son from Sarah, which foreshadowed God's one son from Mary, and that the son will be a substitution sacrifice for mankind. We have all these components. It's much easier for us to see it after the fact. It's all happened. It's all recorded. We have the whole Bible, Genesis through Revelation, to study and to learn, and it's in our language now that we can do that. So we have the benefit of hindsight for sure. So it's much easier to see now in retrospect than what it was at the time of living through it. But what a wonderful thing that all that happened and it was recorded, and we're still not out of Genesis, the book of Genesis. So it's happening, and that's a perspective that we want to keep going with forward in these sessions, that it's God's rescue and restoration plan unfolding. And as we go along in history, it's going to become clearer and clearer what he's going for and then what happens. So that is the end of today's session. Thank you for joining us today, me today. It was a pleasure and a privilege, and we'll see you next time.